The 1960s dawned with the Formula One scene firmly centred on Britain. Defending world champion Jack Brabham and Stirling Moss continued their duel in 1960 as Lotus and Cooper became the front-running cars. Ferrari was now the only non-British team. In sports cars, Ferrari was challenged by Porsche, especially in the Targa Florio, though Le Mans was a prancing horse preserve.
Top drivers line up for the 150-mile New Zealand Grand Prix. There's British ace Stirling Moss giving last-minute instructions to his pit crew. There's Australia's world champion Jack Brabham. They're off. Moss, nearest to camera, gets away well and takes an early lead from Brabham and New Zealander Bruce McLaren. Moss in front, but after 27 laps he has to withdraw, and from then on it's all Brabham. They hit well over 100 miles per hour in the straight, and the crowd of 85,000 cheers as the winner flashes over the line. It's Brabham first, McLaren second, then Stillwell and Jones. World champion Brabham receives his trophy from Prime Minister Nash after winning his second New Zealand Grand Prix.
In contrast to the warm weather down under, there were the usual icy conditions for the Monte Carlo rally. Among the entrants were 6 of the newly released Mini, which went on to make a big impact in rallying and ultimately the motor industry. 23rd was the best place a works entry could manage. Mercedes 220 SEs dominated the 1960 Monte Carlo rally, taking the first 3 places, with Walter Schock and Rolf Moll the victors. The World Sports Car Championship began in Argentina with the Buenos Aires 1,000 kilometers. 1959 champions Aston Martin had pulled out of racing, and Ferrari now faced the challenge of Porsche. Maserati were making a comeback to racing through customer-entered Tipo 61s. First away, the Maserati of Dan Gurney and Maston Gregory. The Sports Car World Championship was held over 6 rounds, starting in Argentina, then travelling to Sebring, the Targa Florio, Nurburgring 1,000 kilometers, and finally Le Mans. Richie Ginther and Wolfgang von Tripp's Ferrari set the quickest lap in practice. Harry Blanchard died when his Porsche 718 overturned. The race continued with the Ginther von Tripp's Ferrari in second place. Phil Hill and Cliff Allison took over the lead from the Gregory Gurney Maserati, which had gearbox and suspension troubles. Maurice Trintignant and Hans Hermann finished 7th. Just ahead, the Christian Goethals Kurt Delfosse 718 was 6th. The winners in the Buenos Aires 1,000 kilometers, Phil Hill and Cliff Allison in the 250 Testarossa from teammates Ginther and von Trips. Joe Bonnier and Graham Hill's Porsche was 3rd. The Formula One World Championship also started in Argentina, but on the permanent Oscar Galvez circuit. Jack Brabham had last year's Cooper T51. Scotsman Innes Ireland led Team Lotus in the new lightweight 18. Ferrari began with old Dino 246s. Stirling Moss was on pole in his Cooper, with Innes Ireland alongside. But Moss made a poor start and was 8th at the end of lap 1. He managed to pass 5 cars to be 3rd behind Graham Hill and Joe Bonnier in BRM P57s. Moss passed Hill on lap 10 and took the lead from Bonnier on lap 15. Juan Manuel Fangio watched on. On lap 42, Moss retired with a broken suspension, leaving Bonnier nearly a lap ahead of Innes Ireland. A splash and dash for Froilan Gonzalez, making a one-off appearance for Ferrari. Roberto Monomi received the same refreshment. With 12 laps to go, Bonnier suffered engine trouble. Ireland led, only to have his gear linkage jam, allowing Bruce McLaren to take the win. Cliff Allison was 2nd for Ferrari, while Moss took over Maurice Trintignant's Cooper for 3rd. On the aeroplane back from Argentina, Jack Brabham and John Cooper started designing a new car, the T53 Lowline. Round 3 of the Sports Car World Championship was the Targa Florio, the road race run around Sicily. Porsche had won round 2 of the championship, the Sebring 12-hour, with Hans Hermann and Olivier Gendebien. From outright sports races to hotted-up saloons, the cars left the start line at Palermo at 1-minute intervals. They headed out for 10 laps of the 72-kilometre Piccolo circuit. The Targa Florio was the type of race that would suit the nimble cars from Stuttgart. Cliff Allison and Richie Ginther's 250TR crashed out after 5 laps. The new mid-engine 246S of Von Trips and Phil Hill made its international debut. Vincenzo Riolo and Alessandro Federico's Alfa Romeo Giulietta SS finished 13th. The rare Cooper Monaco T49 Maserati of Colin Davis and Raffaella Camarota. Joe Bonnier and Hans Hermann won the Targa Florio by 6 minutes from the Von Trips Hill Ferrari. 84 cars entered the Nurburgring 1,000 kilometres, round 4 of the championship. Mist and fog remained all day. Jim Clark in the Border Reivers Aston Martin DBR1 took the lead. Clark was passed by Stirling Moss in the Lucky Kasna-entered Maserati Tipo 61 he was sharing with Dan Gurney. The 718 RS60 Porsche of Joe Bonnier and Olivier Gendebien was chasing. By quarter distance, Moss led 2 Porsches and 2 Ferraris. The Cliff Allison Willie Marais Phil Hill 250TR. Mike Taylor and Christopher Martin's Lotus 15. Dan Gurney had an oil problem, which meant a long pit stop. He returned to the track behind Phil Hill and Joe Bonnier. Gurney made up 30 seconds a lap in the densest fog and mist of the day, before Stirling Moss drove on to victory for Maserati. Round 2 of the Grand Prix season was at Monaco. Richie Ginther was at the wheel of the first rear-engine car from Maranello, the 246P. Cliff Allison's Ferrari career ended with a crash in practice. Wealthy American Lance Raventlow debuted his Scarab. Formula Junior founder Count Johnny Lorani talked to Colin Chapman. Stirling Moss had seen how promising Chapman's Lotus 18 was, so his patron Rob Walker brought one. Joe Bonnier took the lead in the BRM. Moss passed Bonnier on lap 17. The race was turned upside down when rain came. Jack Brabham in the new low-line T53 passed Bonnier and Moss while Brooks spun, leaving McLaren in 4th battling with Phil Hill. Dan Gurney had brake problems in his BRM. Phil Hill spun his Ferrari at the station hairpin. Brabham crashed into the wall at Saint-Devote and retired. Moss had to pit to replace a plug lead, and so Bonnier took over until Moss caught him again. A rueful Jack Brabham. Bonnier retired with broken suspension and Graham Hill crashed. Others like Innes Ireland brought out their stricken cars in an attempt to get World Championship points. After 100 laps, Stirling Moss gave Lotus their first World Championship Grand Prix win. Bruce McLaren finished 2nd, with Phil Hill 3rd and Tony Brooks the only other survivor. 2 wins from 2 races put Stirling Moss in a strong championship position. Tragedy struck the 1960 Indianapolis 500, but not on the track. Before the start, a homemade spectator scaffold collapsed, killing 2 people. On track, it was a repeat of the 4-way battle of the previous year between Jim Rathman, Roger Ward, Johnny Thompson and Eddie Sachs. This quartet disputed the lead for much of the race until Ward and Rathman went head-to-head in the final stages. A pit stop for 3rd-placed Paul Goldsmith. Despite this spin, Dwayne Carter went on to finish 12th. '65 Curtis Stevenson was carried away from his car after clipping the wall. McWithy's Eppley Offenhauser ran out of brakes, hence the uncontrolled but slow journey through the pit lane. Roger Ward suffered a tyre problem with only 3 laps to go and was passed by Jim Rathman in the Ken Paul Special Watson Offenhauser. At the end of 3 hours and 36 minutes of racing, Rathman was a comfortable 15 seconds ahead of Ward. This was the final Indianapolis 500 to count for the World Drivers' Championship. There were disputes over prize money and several teams withdrew from the Dutch Grand Prix. Jack Brabham was anxious to make up for his Monaco mistake. Stirling Moss was on pole with Innes Ireland third. BRMs of Joe Bonnier and Graham Hill shared the second row. Brabham made the best start and led Moss and Ireland. Alan Stacey passed Lotus teammate Ireland on the second lap, but Innes took it back. Cooper's Bruce McLaren moved ahead of Phil Hill's Ferrari, but retired with a driveshaft problem. Newcomer Jim Clark was running 6th in his Lotus. Dan Gurney was holding 5th in his BRM when he crashed at Tarzan Hairpin after a brake failure. A spectator standing in a prohibited area was killed. On lap 17, Brabham's Cooper threw up a concrete curbstone which hit Moss's car, causing a puncture and wheel hub damage. Moss had to pit for repairs. The order was Brabham, Ireland, and Graham Hill, who passed Clark when the Scot had gearbox failure. Alan Stacey would retire with a similar problem, leaving Hill to finish third, just ahead of a charging Stirling Moss. Jack Brabham powered his way to his first win of the year, at last getting his title defence underway. The Ferraris of Phil Hill and Richie Ginther were 5th and 6th, but a lap behind the leaders. Ferrari was hard at work on their mid-engined car. The Belgian Grand Prix of 1960 was a disaster. There were 2 big accidents in practice. Stirling Moss suffered an axle failure and was thrown from his Lotus, breaking both legs. Then Mike Taylor had steering failure in his Lotus, the crash ending his career. Jack Brabham took pole, 2.5 seconds faster than the older BRP-run Cooper of Tony Brooks, with Phil Hill's Ferrari sharing the front row. Behind them were the BRP Cooper of local hero Olivier Gendebien and Graham Hill's BRM. Brabham took the lead, followed by Gendebien. Lotus's Innes Ireland then moved into second until he retired with clutch trouble. On lap 17, BRP Cooper driver Chris Bristow, who was fighting for 6th with the Ferrari of Willy Marécy, lost control at Malmedy and crashed. He was thrown from the car and died. Within 5 laps, Alan Stacey of Team Lotus was also dead, having been hit in the face by a bird near Masta. He crashed, was thrown from his car and killed. Despite these gruesome accidents, the race continued with Jack Brabham firmly in the lead, with Bruce McLaren following in his wheel tracks. Graham Hill was third in the BRM P57. Brabham won the Belgian Grand Prix with muted celebrations. Stirling Moss began his recovery in England, while Alan Stacey and Chris Bristow's families were left to count the tragic cost of motorsport. With 8 works and quasi-works entries, Ferrari fully expected to win the Le Mans 24-hour race in 1960. Dan Gurney and Walt Hansgen had the Jaguar E2A prototype. It was quick, but soon retired. Willie Maresi and Richie Ginther's Ferrari was destined to be a non-finisher. The Maserati challenge fizzled out. 59 winner Roy Salvadori was with Jim Clark, sharing an Aston Martin DBR1, entered by Scottish team Border Reivers. They took 3rd place, the only non-Ferrari in the top 7. Olivier Gendebien was back with Ferrari after some drives for Porsche. He combined with fellow Belgian Paul Frere, and they dominated the race from start to finish in their Testarossa. With the best 5 results counting, Ferrari were the 1960s sports car world champions.
Thrills at the French Grand Prix start the moment the flag drops. Hill's BRM in the front row fails to start. Trintignant's Cooper rams it, Halford's Cooper goes into a spin, and Bianchi's Cooper pulls away with a crushed radiator cowl. Somehow the mess sorts itself out, though there's some hasty patching up for the pit stop to do. From the very first lap, it's an all-out battle between the British and Italian machines. World champion Jack Brabham, number 16, is well up, and Bruce McLaren and Innes Island. Brabham's Cooper and Phil Hill's Ferrari battle desperately to get a nose in front of each other, with the rest of the field trailing behind, sometimes losing the way. But in the end, it's Jack Brabham who gets the upper hand, streaking ahead for his 3rd consecutive Grand Prix victory at a record speed for the course of 131.7 miles per hour. The Italians are nowhere. First 8 places go to British machines. And for Jack, one more step towards retaining the world crown.
Olivier Gendebien took 2nd in the BRP Cooper, with Bruce McLaren 3rd in the factory Cooper. Stirling Moss had recovered sufficiently from his broken legs to travel by helicopter to the British Grand Prix at Silverstone. He received a warm reception from the crowd, eager to find out when he would be returning to the track.
A big day of British motor racing, the Grand Prix at Silverstone. World champion Jack Brabham's ready, and a very welcome sight is Stirling Moss, who has flown from hospital to start the race everyone wishes he was driving it. Stirling gets them away, all except Graham Hill's BRM, which stalls. But the pit boys soon get him started, and he seems all the more determined because, to the delight of the crowd, he's soon up among the leaders, chasing Jack Brabham for all he's worth. Brabham's Cooper Climax well in front, but Hill's driving like a genius, better than he's ever done, and a terrific battle with Brabham puts him ahead. John Surtees went up too, but Hill spun off the course, and Jack Brabham's the winner with Surtees 2nd. Tough luck on Hill, but he's not hurt. And for Australian Jack Brabham, this means he's practically certain to retain the World Championship in 1960. Earl Howe presents the British Grand Prix trophy to the victor. One more for an overcrowded mantelpiece.
Jack Brabham took his 4th win in a row from motorbike ace John Surtees, who was making the transition to 4-wheel racing. There was a month between the British and Portuguese Grand Prix, and Stirling Moss made his Formula 1 comeback in Oporto. Pole went to Team Lotus driver John Surtees, who edged out Dan Gurney's BRM. Jack Brabham was 3rd quickest. Moss put his Lotus on the 2nd row alongside Graham Hill's BRM. Brabham took the lead, but Gurney quickly found a way ahead. Brabham ran wide and dropped to 6th. Moss emerged in 2nd with Surtees and Phil Hill in his Ferrari fighting for position. After 10 laps, Gurney dropped back with an oil leak. Surtees took over with Moss in pursuit, but he had to stop because of spark plug problems. Moss gets a helping hand. Brabham had a lively fight with Phil Hill until the American crashed. On lap 36, Surtees went off when oil leaked onto his pedals, putting Jack Brabham back in front. Bruce McLaren came through to finish 2nd for another Cooper 1-2. with Jim Clark finishing third in his cobbled-together Lotus, damaged in a practice crash. Moss was later disqualified for driving against the direction of the race while trying to get going after a spin. Jack Brabham's victory meant that he clinched the World Championship with 2 races remaining. The Italian authorities decided that the Italian Grand Prix would be held on the combined road and oval Monza track, and all the main British teams boycotted the race. Ferrari dominated, with Phil Hill sharing the front row with Richie Ginther and Willie Maresi. Formula 2 cars were allowed, with Porsche racing a pair of 718s for Hans Hermann and Edgar Barth. Ginther and Hill led, while Maresi was slowed by team orders to help tow a 4th Ferrari, a Formula 2 car being driven by Wolfgang von Trips, away from the 2 Porsches. This helped Giulio Cabianca into 3rd in his Castellotti Cooper. Maresi eventually made his way back to 3rd place, while Hill passed his former mechanic Richie Ginther to win the race. Ferraris finished 1, 2, 3, their only win of the year, and the last by a front-engined Grand Prix car. The final World Championship event of the year took place 10 weeks after the Italian Grand Prix, and Ferrari didn't bother to travel to Riverside in California. Moss, by now fully recovered from his mid-season crash, took pole by 0.6 of a second from Jack Brabham and Dan Gurney. Joe Bonnier's BRM shared the second row with Jim Clark's Lotus. Brabham made the best start and led Moss for the first 4 laps, but he heard an explosion at the back of the car and pitted. The Australian made 2 stops to try to solve the problem, which was traced to overflow petrol hitting the hot exhausts of the Coventry Climax engine. Moss assumed the lead when Brabham pitted and stayed there all the way to the checkered flag. There at the first and last races of the 2.5-litre formula, 6 years apart, was the 250F Maserati. Bob Drake finished 13th, and Chuck Day finished 10th in the Scarab's last race. Moss was chased by Gurney. He retired with plug problems, and Bonnier followed, retiring from second with engine trouble. That left Innes Ireland to finish second for Team Lotus, with the Cooper of Bruce McLaren third. Jack Brabham was fourth, a lap behind. Jim Hall, later to make his name with Chaparral, was running fourth, but dropped to seventh at the end when his transmission failed and he had to push the car to the finish. 1960 was a triumph for Jack Brabham and for Cooper. Bruce McLaren finished second, and the small team from London won the Constructors' Cup for the second year in a row. A new formula beckoned for 1961. Who was best prepared? The racing year is 1961. And in Grand Prix racing there's a new 1.5-litre formula. Ferrari was well prepared with a distinctive shark nose 156. Americans Phil Hill and Richie Ginther and Germany's aristocratic Wolfgang von Trips led the Maranello team. Porsche stepped up to Formula 1 with Dan Gurney, Joe Bonnier and Hans Hermann. In sports cars it was Italy versus Germany, Ferrari versus Porsche. The bright lights of Auckland brought most of the Formula 1 teams, with the exception of Ferrari, to contest the New Zealand Grand Prix at Ardmore early in January. Cooper, BRM, Team Lotus and Rob Walker's Lotus for Stirling Moss all made the journey to the airfield circuit. Moss retired from the race, and defending world champion Jack Brabham was able to hold off his teammate and local favourite Bruce McLaren to win the Grand Prix. Graham Hill was third in the BRM P48, while a new name in fifth was Denny Hulme. The Monte Carlo rally was as icy as ever, conditions which suited smaller capacity cars more than in previous years. Renault and Ford Anglia on the Alpine stages, while an Alfa makes roadside repairs. The rally finished with a short race around the Monaco Grand Prix circuit. This year it was a 1-2-3 to Panhard, Maurice Martin and Roger Bateau in the PL17 Tigre with its two-cylinder, air-cooled 850cc boxer engine, the winners. The Sports Car World Championship began with the Sebring 12-hour race in Florida. Porsche presented the only challenge to Ferrari now that Aston Martin and Jaguar had effectively left the sport. Maserati continued with their customer teams. Graham Hill in the Cameradi Maserati Tipo 61 he shared with Stirling Moss. Setting the pace were young Mexican brothers Pedro and Ricardo Rodriguez in the number 17 Ferrari Testarossa. At 6 hours, the order was the Rodriguez Ferrari leading the similar Phil Hill Olivier Gendebien car. Third was the Bruce McLaren Walt Hansken Maserati Tipo 63. The Rodriguez Ferrari dropped back to second, passed by Hill and Gendebien. The Arnold Deluxe Bristol of Bud Stevens and Robert Gary recovered from a spin. Chuck Castle and David Lane's Porsche. The Ferrari of Baghetti, Maresi, Ginther and Von Trips was third. Best placed Porsche was Bob Holbert and Roger Penske in fifth behind 4 Ferraris. The established sports car masters, Phil Hill and Olivier Gendebien, won by 2 laps. The European racing season began with the 21st Pau Grand Prix around the streets of the resort city in the shadow of the Pyrenees, and with it, the new 1.5-litre Formula One era. Jack Brabham started from pole position, but was passed by Jim Clark, who led throughout the 100-lap race. Brabham retired on lap 10 with a fuel pump failure. Chasing Jim Clark was Joe Bonnier driving the Scuderia Colonia Lotus 18. Maurice Trintignant retired his Cooper with ignition trouble on lap 62. Joe Bonnier was nearly a minute behind as Jim Clark raced to the flag. Lucien Bianchi crashed out in his Emma Riesen. The Pau Grand Prix was Jim Clark's first Formula One victory. The early season Formula One races took teams north to Belgium for the Brussels Grand Prix. It was held on a track near the Palais des Expositions at Heysel. Bruce McLaren lined up for the final race of the day with Jack Brabham behind. The Grand Prix was held over 3 heats, with an aggregate result. Of international interest, Porsche made their Grand Prix debut, with Joe Bonnier and Dan Gurney driving the 718s. And a winning debut it was, with Bonnier leading home his rivals in Heat 1. Jack Brabham won the second heat. In the third heat, Jack and Stirling Moss had a spirited battle. Brabham emerged the narrow winner in the race and the comfortable winner of the Brussels Grand Prix overall. Later in April was the Syracuse Grand Prix in Italy. Stirling Moss and Jack Brabham talked. The only Ferrari competing was a 166 Formula 2 car fitted with the 1.5-litre V6 engine. It was entrusted to 27-year-old newcomer Giancarlo Baghetti and run in the colours of the Federazione Italiana Scuderia Automobilistiche to help promising Italian drivers. Dan Gurney's Porsche 718 was in pole position. After John Surtees briefly held the lead in his Yeoman Credit Cooper, it became a Ferrari-Porsche duel. The British teams were very tired, with most having come straight from a race at Aintree. For example, Team Lotus had 2 cars, 2 drivers and 2 mechanics. After a race-long battle with Dan Gurney, Giancarlo Baghetti won the Syracuse Grand Prix, the only driver to win a Grand Prix on debut. Baghetti next went on to win the Naples Grand Prix. Round 2 of the Sports Car World Championship was the Targa Florio in Sicily. Porsche had a full team of the 2-litre 718s for Joe Bonnier and Dan Gurney, Hans Hermann and Edgar Barth, and Stirling Moss and Graham Hill. Ferrari had the mid-engine 246P for Wolfgang von Trips and Olivier Gendebien. Hill and Moss were the quickest qualifiers in the 2-litre class. Third car through is the rare Fiat 8V of Sergio Mantia and Giovanni Napoli. The von Trips Gendebien Ferrari with minor panel damage. Ernesto Bosco and Bruno Bevilacqua's Giulietta Spider. Graham Hill and Stirling Moss's Porsche 718 retired with gearbox trouble, while Hans Hermann and Edgar Barth were second. Wolfgang von Trips and Olivier Gendebien winners by 4.5 minutes. The Formula One World Championship started at Monaco. Stirling Moss took pole in his Lotus 18 with Richie Ginther's Ferrari and Jim Clark's Lotus alongside. Ginther took the lead from Clark and Moss. Clark soon had to pit with fuel pump problems, so Bonnier and Gurney took over 3rd and 4th in their Porsches. On lap 14, both Moss and Bonnier passed Ginther. 10 laps later, Phil Hill passed Ginther and Bonnier to move into 2nd. Stirling Moss was racing without side panels on his Lotus because of an incident that happened on the grid. With minutes to go before the start, he noticed a crack in the chassis frame. Mechanic Al Francis removed the side panels, doused the area with water, and despite the full fuel tanks, welded the frame together with a gas torch. Mid-distance, Ginther fought back, passing Hill and chasing after Moss. Ginther set the equal fastest lap in his efforts to catch the leader. Moss responded and took a magnificent victory. Ginther was 2nd, Phil Hill 3rd, and Wolfgang von Trips was classified 4th despite crashing on the last lap. Dan Gurney's Porsche was 5th. Coventry Climax was busy making a 1.5-litre V8 engine to try to match Ferrari's powerful V6. There was just a week between Monaco and the Dutch Grand Prix. Ferrari monopolised the front row in Holland, with Phil Hill on pole from von Trips and Ginther, while Stirling Moss's Lotus and Graham Hill's BRM shared the 2nd row. Von Trips took the lead, with Graham and Phil Hill behind him. Graham Hill soon fell back, behind Phil Hill and Jim Clark, who had stormed through to be 4th at the end of the opening lap. Clark and Hill exchanged places several times, before the American finally asserted himself. Graham Hill battled with Moss and Ginther, but it was the Ferrari driver who was ahead for most of the race. On the last lap, Ginther ran wide when his throttle stuck open and Moss was able to grab 4th. Jack Brabham finished 6th. Wolfgang von Trips was the comfortable winner from Phil Hill, with Jim Clark 3rd, his best Grand Prix result to date. The 1960 Dutch Grand Prix has its own place in Formula One history. Every starter finished the race and no one went into the pits. Round 3 of the Sports Car World Championship was the Nurburgring 1,000 kilometres. Stirling Moss in the Porsche 718 and Jim Clark in the Aston Martin DBR1 led away. Phil Hill and Wolfgang von Tripp's race was over with a fiery crash in the 246 SP. Stirling Moss drifts the Porsche. The Maserati Tipo 61 of Maston Gregory and team owner Lloyd Kastner ahead of Ricardo and Pedro Rodriguez Testarossa. Richie Ginther and Olivier Gendebier's Dino 246 SP set the pace in qualifying. Moss and Graham Hill were destined to retire with engine trouble. Lawrence and Shepard Barron's Morgan 4-4 passes Kreft and Neifeler's Porsche. A repeat win for Maserati at the Nürburgring. Maston Gregory and Lloyd Kastner taking the honours from the Rodriguez Ferrari. The speed and depth of the Ferrari squad would make them very difficult to beat at Le Mans. Fastest in qualifying was the Von Tripp's Ginther Dino 246, ahead of the Rodriguez Testarossa. Phil Hill and Olivier Gendebien were reunited and put their stamp on the race. The experienced duo went just as fast as they had to in the number 10 Testarossa. Walt Hansken crashed the Maserati before Bruce McLaren could have a drive. The Rodriguez Ferrari was pushed away with engine failure in the last hour. This was Ferrari's 5th Le Mans win, Gendebien's 3rd and Hill's 2nd. Ferrari comfortably won the 1961 World Sports Car Championship from Porsche. The Belgian Grand Prix at Spa-Francorchamps was a straight fight between the Ferraris of Phil Hill, Wolfgang von Trips, Richie Ginther and Olivier Gendebien. Ferrari had a 4th car painted up in Belgian racing yellow for Gendebien, run by Écurie Nationale Belge. Hill started from pole, with von Trips alongside. Gendebien made the most of his local experience to take 3rd, despite using a less powerful engine than the factory Ferraris. Richie Ginther's Ferrari shared the 2nd row with John Surtees in Reg Parnell's Cooper Climax. Phil Hill took the lead but was then passed by Gendebien. Von Trips and Ginther joined in the fun in what looked like a Ferrari demonstration run. While Gendebien was a noted sports car driver, he only raced occasionally in Grand Prix. The Porsches of Dan Gurney and Joe Bonnier circulated together. Phil Hill narrowly won the Belgian Grand Prix from Wolfgang von Trips, with Richie Ginther 3rd and Olivier Gendebien 4th, giving Ferrari a straight 1-2-3-4 result. John Surtees finished 5th after a battle with Graham Hill's BRM, which eventually went out with electrical trouble. Dan Gurney finished 6th in his Porsche. A fortnight after the Belgian Grand Prix, the teams gathered at Reims. Oppressive heat and melting tarmac were going to be the biggest problems for the drivers. Ferrari again had a 4th car, run by the Italian Federation for Giancarlo Baghetti. Von Trips chats to Hill, and Richie Ginther joins the conversation. Their 3 Ferraris occupied the front row. Hill led away, with Ginther and Von Trips giving chase. But when Ginther spun, Moss was able to take 3rd before the American recovered. Further back, there was an exciting slipstreaming battle between 7 cars. The Porsches of Dan Gurney and Joe Bonnier, the Lotuses of Clark and Ireland, Graham Hill's BRM, Bruce McLaren's Cooper and the Ferrari of Baghetti. Eventually Ginther passed Moss and Stirling dropped back because of brake trouble. Then Ferrari faltered. Von Trips, who had taken the lead under team orders, stopped with engine trouble on lap 18. Phil Hill lapped Stirling Moss approaching Tilloy, but had a slow speed spin on the melting tarmac. Moss's Lotus then clouted the Ferrari. Moss was out, and it was a long push to the finish for Phil Hill. He didn't score any points. Ginther only lasted 3 laps in the lead before he too stopped with an engine problem. Gradually the challengers dropped away, leaving Gurney's Porsche and Baghetti's Ferrari. On the final lap, Baghetti dived out of Gurney's slipstream to pass the American a couple of 100 metres before the finish. Giancarlo Baghetti became the first and, to date, only driver to win his first World Championship event. A wet British Grand Prix at Aintree saw the win go to Wolfgang von Trips ahead of Phil Hill and Richie Ginther. For the German Grand Prix, Ferrari again entered 4 cars, William Aracy taking over the older 156. Qualifying saw Phil Hill record a lap of 8 minutes 55 seconds, a full 6 seconds faster than Jack Brabham, with Stirling Moss third quickest. The race started in damp conditions and Brabham led the field away with the new Climax V8 FWMV engine in his Cooper. But Jack spun out and crashed on his first lap. That put Moss in the lead, ahead of Joe Bonnier and Dan Gurney's Porsches. We ride with Moss on the daunting Nordschleife. Phil Hill took the lead on the first lap, but Moss put the American back to second before they reached the finish line. Porsche entered 4 cars for their home race, Edgar Barth joining Bonnier, Gurney and Hans Hermann. Moss stayed ahead for the rest of the race, while Wolfgang von Trips passed Phil Hill for second after a long battle. Towards the end of the German Grand Prix, it started to rain. However, this had no effect on Moss, who extended his lead over von Trips. This win turned out to be Stirling Moss's last World Championship Grand Prix victory. Wolfgang von Trips was second, building up his points lead over Phil Hill as they prepared for the Italian Grand Prix. The Tourist Trophy at Goodwood wasn't part of the World Sports Car Championship, but it was a showdown between road-going GT cars, the 250 GT SWB Ferraris and the Zagato-bodied Aston Martin DB4 GTs. Stirling Moss in the dark blue number 7 Rob Walker Ferrari was the car to beat, chased by the red version of the up-and-coming Mike Parks. The Aston Martins of Jim Clark and Roy Salvadori took third and fourth, behind the Ferraris of Moss and Parks. The penultimate race of the 1961 World Championship was to be a showdown between Wolfgang von Trips and Phil Hill. Ferrari had a new recruit at Monza, Ricardo Rodriguez, taking over the team's 4th car. From the start, Phil Hill and Ginther managed to get into 1st and 2nd places, followed by Rodriguez, the fast-starting Jim Clark, and von Trips. Von Trips passed Clark at the Violoni curve, but didn't realise that the Scot was still in his slipstream. The German pulled across for his normal approach to the Parabolica, but the 2 cars touched. Clark crashed without injury, but the Ferrari hit a spectator fence and was tossed into a roll. Wolfgang von Trips and 15 spectators died in the horrific accident. The full lap was 10 kilometres, so by the time Phil Hill came round again, much of the debris had been cleared away.
So it's hard enough trying to concentrate on the job at hand in a racing car. When I saw Tripp's car upside down and badly battered, it looked bad, but at the same time I'd seen any number of accidents where drivers had walked away.
Rodriguez, Ginther and Baghetti retired with engine troubles, leaving Hill comfortably in the lead. Jack Brabham also retired. Aware that there had been an accident, but unaware of just how serious it was, Phil Hill drove on to victory.
But when I drove in and saw the face of the chief engineer, Keaty, I knew on an unconscious level then that he was dead. There is no huge emotional shock because you're unconsciously protected from it. The bang of an unexpected death is not there.
The awful accident meant that Phil Hill became the first American to win the Formula One World Championship. But there was no celebrating at Monza on that fateful day. Dan Gurney was second and Bruce McLaren third. Phil Hill was a pallbearer at Wolfgang von Tripp's funeral in Germany. Ferrari had lost another frontline driver. Ferrari didn't bother with the United States Grand Prix. After Jack Brabham and Stirling Moss retired, Innes Ireland came through to take Team Lotus' first win. With the best 5 scores to count, Phil Hill had become world champion by the narrowest margin. In 1962, would Ferrari continue to lead the way, or were the British teams ready to fight back? It's 1962, and in the racing year, British teams BRM and Lotus, and British drivers Graham Hill and Jim Clark are to the fore. Double world champion Jack Brabham left Cooper to set up his own team, and John Surtees joined Yeoman Credit Lola. Ferrari had world champion Phil Hill as their lead driver. In sports cars, Ferrari faced less opposition than before, with Porsche concentrating on Formula One. The Monte Carlo rally continued to draw a wide range of manufacturers to test out their cars in Europe's toughest winter rally. First of the noted Scandinavian drivers, Sweden's Erik Karlsson made his international breakthrough, winning with Gunnar Hagborn in the front-wheel drive Saab 96. In second was the Mercedes 220 SE of Eugen Boehringer, with Paddy Hopkirk third in the Sunbeam Rapier. Winner of the Coupe des Dames were Pat Moss, sister of Stirling, and Anne Wisdom. A year later, Pat Moss and Erik Karlsson were married. In 1962, the focus of sports car racing shifted to production-based GT cars. The World Sports Car Championship title was discontinued, replaced by the International Championship for GT manufacturers, which was awarded in 3-engine capacity classes. There were 65 entries for the Sebring 12-hour race, with Ferrari again expected to be the dominant force. The Porsche 718 RSK of Bob Donner and Don Sessler retired with gearbox problems. The Dino 246 Ferrari of Bob Grossman, Pedro Rodriguez and Alan Connell set the fastest lap. Joe Bonnier and Lucien Bianchi in the Ferrari 250 Testarossa, chased by the TVR Grand Tourer of Mark Donoghue and Jay Signori. The importance of the GT class was shown when Ferrari paired their long-distance aces Phil Hill and Olivier Jean-Debienne in the 250 GTO. They finished second. Ferrari was set to have an association with Stirling Moss in both sports cars and Formula One in 1962. This entry at Sebring was the first indication, but sharing with Innes Ireland, John Fulp and Fernando Tervano, Moss's Ferrari was disqualified after illegal refueling. Driving the Testarossa entered by Scuderia Repubblica di Venezia, Sweden's Joe Bonnier and Belgium's Lucien Bianchi won the Sebring 12-hour race. The Formula One season began with the Brussels Grand Prix run at Heysel on the public road course. Held over 3 aggregate heats, the Brussels Grand Prix was run in wet conditions. Jim Clark started from pole in the new Lotus 24. Graham Hill took Heat 1 in the debut of the BRM P57 with its distinctive stack exhaust pipes. Trailing this group, Swiss driver Joe Siffert. Ferrari entered one car for local driver Willy Maresi. He won the second heat from Joe Bonnier's Porsche. In the third heat, Maresi had a comfortable 30-second win over Bonnier, a popular winner of the Brussels Grand Prix. The Easter meeting at Goodwood opened the British racing season with all the local teams represented. Stirling Moss was in the Lotus 18/21, painted in BRP colours. From the front row, Graham Hill made a slow start in the BRM, but soon took the lead from Bruce McLaren's Cooper. Moss got away quickly, but had to pit with throttle problems. He returned to the race 2 laps down, but was trying to unlap himself when he left the track at high speed and slammed into an earth bank. Moss was taken to Atkinson Morley Hospital, Wimbledon, and remained unconscious for nearly 6 weeks. The first thing he remembered after regaining consciousness was seeing his room filled with flowers. Recovery was very slow as he regained his speech and physical ability. After 13 weeks in hospital, Moss was ready to face the press and to consider his future.
Quite honestly, I have too much pride, I suppose, if you like, to want to go in racing and find myself trailing around at the back. I just don't reckon that that's the thing to do. I mean, if you find your punch drunk, I reckon you get out of it.
The second major sports car race of the year was the Targa Florio in Sicily. Giorgio Scarlatti and Pietro Ferraro's 250 GTO. The semi-works Porsche 718 GTR Coupe of Nino Vaccarella and Joe Bonnier. Lorenzo Bandini and Giancarlo Baghetti in the Dino 196 SP. And last away, Willy Maresi, Ricardo Rodriguez and Olivier Gendebien shared the Dino 246 SP. The Targa was held over 10 laps of the 72-kilometre Piccolo Madonni road circuit. Ludovico Scarfiotti and Odoardo Giovoni's Oscar S2000 retired with engine problems. Bandini and Baghetti were part of the new generation of Italian racers. The Porsche pits in Palermo. Vincenzo and Antonio Rioli's Maserati T60 didn't reach the finish. After 7 hours of racing, the Willy Maresi, Ricardo Rodriguez, Olivier Gendebien Dino 246 won by 12 minutes from the Bandini Baghetti Dino 196. In third place, the Porsche of Nino Vaccarella and Joe Bonnier. Triple celebrations for Ferrari. The first round of the 1962 Formula One World Championship was the Dutch Grand Prix at Zandvoort. BRM was confident. Colin Chapman introduced his new car, the Lotus 25, with its monocoque chassis. BRM's Richie Ginther carried out most of his team's testing. John Surtees put his Lola on pole position, with Graham Hill and Jim Clark alongside. Clark took the lead, chased by Graham Hill and Dan Gurney in his Porsche, now with an 8-cylinder engine. Clark pulled away until lap 10 when he was slowed by clutch problems, eventually finishing 9th. Graham Hill took the lead and Ferrari's Phil Hill ran second for much of the race. The race ended with Graham Hill a clear winner, his first Grand Prix victory. In the closing laps, Phil Hill was passed by new Lotus driver Trevor Taylor. Graham Hill was presented with the trophy to the delight of BRM founder Raymond Mays and designer Tony Rudd. Trevor Taylor finished second. Phil Hill and Giancarlo Baghetti gave Ferrari third and fourth. The second round was the Monaco Grand Prix. Jim Clark took pole position in his Lotus with Graham Hill and Bruce McLaren sharing the front row. Willie Moracy forced his Ferrari between Hill's BRM and Clark's Lotus approaching the gasworks hairpin, causing a huge crash. It eliminated Richie Ginther's BRM, the Lotus of Maurice Trintignant, and Dan Gurney's Porsche. After 10 laps, Graham Hill began to pull away from McLaren's Cooper. On lap 28, Jim Clark overtook McLaren for second. He closed on Hill until his Lotus began having gearbox trouble. That left Graham Hill with a 48-second lead over Bruce McLaren. By lap 90, Graham was in a commanding lead, but was losing his oil pressure, and the engine finally expired on lap 93. That handed the race to Bruce McLaren, who won by just 2 seconds from Phil Hill, with new Ferrari teammate Lorenzo Bandini third. A delighted John Cooper with the Monaco Grand Prix trophy. Porsche wasn't at the Belgian Grand Prix because of a strike in Stuttgart. In qualifying, Graham Hill was fastest, with Bruce McLaren alongside in his Cooper and Trevor Taylor third quickest. Jim Clark had mechanical trouble and had to wait for a new engine. Eventually, he used Taylor's car and ended up 12th on the grid. Graham Hill led away, followed by Trevor Taylor and Bruce McLaren. By the end of lap 1, Hill was in control, but had Taylor, McLaren, a fast-starting Clark, and Moracy right with him. On lap 2, a mysterious misfire dropped Graham Hill behind a stirring battle between Taylor's Lotus and Moracy's Ferrari. On lap 9, Jim Clark was in front, and he then began to pull away from Taylor, who himself moved clear of Moracy until he spun on lap 17. Taylor came under renewed pressure from the Belgian Ferrari driver. On lap 26, Moracy and Taylor collided at high speed. The Lotus hit a telegraph pole, while the Ferrari overturned and caught fire. The flag marshal indicates an ambulance on track going to Moracy's accident. Taylor returned to the pits unhurt but shocked, while Moracy had minor injuries. Jim Clark won his first World Championship Grand Prix for Lotus, Hill's BRM still misfiring in a fortunate second place. Phil Hill was able to hold off Ricardo Rodriguez by a tenth of a second for third place. John Surtees was fifth in the Lola and Jack Brabham sixth in his Lotus 24. This was the first of 4 victories in a row at Spa for Jim Clark. For Le Mans, Ferrari introduced the 330LM with its 4-litre V12.
And number 2 there is Bruce McLaren. There's the Chevrolet getting away right at the top.
Aston Martin had a DP212 for Graham Hill and Richie Ginther.
That's still in front. Number 11 in front is Graham Hill and the Aston Martin. So Graham Hill leads.
There was more emphasis on road-going GT cars than in previous years.
Well up there. 50 by the Hippodrome, and there he goes. There's the Aston Martin in the lead. And I reckon that was Phil Hill in second place with his Ferrari and Mike Parks alongside him.
Soon, though, the Ferrari 330LM of Phil Hill and Olivier Jean-Debienne took control.
But still, it's a very hot pace. Number 11.
The Rodriguez brothers, Ricardo and Pedro, put up a great fight before retiring with transmission problems in their Dino 246P. The Aston Martin challenge didn't last through the night.
Ferrari coming into Terre Rouge. Number 6, Olivier Jean-Debienne. The Belgian driver on the Works 4-litre Ferrari. Graham Hill. There he goes now.
It was another win to Olivier Jean-Debienne and Phil Hill. and Ferrari won the International Championship for GT manufacturers. Second was the Ferrari 250 GTO of Pierre Noblet and Jean Guichet.
20 of the world's best drivers in the Reims Grand Prix. 50 laps of a course just over 5 miles in length.
This race was a non-championship event, but all the Formula One teams apart from Porsche and Ferrari were competing.
Graham Hill, BRM going perfectly, but the lead was now held by Bruce McLaren, Cooper. In great form, Hill hung on and passed Jack Brabham's Lotus. McLaren won at 126 miles an hour. Hill second. Good for you, Mac.
The French Grand Prix returned to Rouen for the first time since 1957. Porsche was back after missing the Belgian Grand Prix, but Ferrari was absent due to industrial action in Italy. Graham Hill took the lead with Surtees, Clark, McLaren, Brabham and Dan Gurney chasing. Tony Maggs in the Cooper. Jim Clark took the lead, but he was in trouble with his suspension and stopped 3 laps later. Graham Hill's BRM had fuel injection trouble during the last few laps. Dan Gurney came through to win for Porsche, the Stuttgart concern's first World Championship victory. Richie Ginther drove the final laps, controlling the throttle by hand after the cable came loose from the pedal.
The British Grand Prix at Aintree. This season's leading driver, Graham Hill, drives a BRM. John Surtees, Lola. Jim Clark in a Works Lotus. The Duke of Kent, well placed to see the start. Terrible luck for Innis Ireland, left standing by gearbox trouble. The race is 75 laps, a total of 225 miles. Berwickshire farmer Jim Clark holds the lead from the start. His only serious challenger, John Surtees, number 24. Bruce McLaren, Cooper. And Jim Clark's the winner. From the editor's wife, Jim receives the Daily Mirror trophy. This Aintree victory puts him in second place in the World Championship.
Jim Clark led from start to finish. The best Graham Hill could manage was 4th with worn tyres. Ferrari was back at full strength for the German Grand Prix, and Jack Brabham debuted his Brabham BT3. The start had to be delayed when a torrential rainstorm swept the Eifel Hills. Dan Gurney led for Porsche until Graham Hill's BRM took over on lap 3. Jim Clark forgot to switch on his petrol pumps and stalled at the start. John Surtees was able to get ahead of Phil Hill. Gurney began to drop back with a battery problem, and so Surtees was able to move to second on lap 5. Clark had driven up through the field and took 4th place on lap 8. Gurney was able to fix the battery problem and moved up again to attack Surtees. Lorenzo Bandini put his Ferrari into a hedge on lap 4. He was able to drag it out and drive it back to the pits, but retired. After their success of 1961, Ferrari hadn't done much development work to the 156, and it was beginning to show. Phil Hill also pulled in, his race over with suspension problems. Porsche's racing manager Huschke von Hanstein encourages Gurney. The privateer Porsche of de Beaufort. Bruce McLaren's Cooper, followed by Dan Gurney. Brabham retired his new car after 8 laps with a throttle problem. Graham Hill was able to win the German Grand Prix from John Surtees. Gurney was 3rd, less than 2 seconds behind. Clark had to settle for 4th, with McLaren 5th and Rodriguez 6th. Hill had a healthy advantage in the World Championship, 28 points to Jim Clark's 21 and John Surtees' 19. In the Italian Grand Prix, Jim Clark beat Graham Hill away from the line, but the BRM's power enabled Hill to get the lead back during the first lap. On lap 3, Clark had gearbox trouble and had to pit, and this left the BRMs of Hill and Ginther 1 and 2. Hill was in a strong position with 2 races to go. With none of its drivers in contention, Ferrari didn't bother to send its cars to Watkins Glen for the US Grand Prix. Jim Clark took the lead, with Hill beating Ginther away. Brabham grabbed 4th ahead of Gurney and McLaren. Gurney was able to get past Brabham and then ahead of Ginther's BRM into 3rd. On lap 12, Graham Hill took the lead, but Clark fought back and moved ahead again on lap 19. The field was bolstered by a number of local drivers, including Roger Penske, Timmy Mayer and Jim Hall. The Gurney-Ginther battle for 3rd continued until Ginther went out with engine trouble on lap 35. The US Grand Prix win to Jim Clark meant that Hill and Clark would go to South Africa in December with the World Championship still open. If Clark won with Hill 2nd, the Lotus driver would take the title with equal points, but 4 wins to Hill's 3. There were 3 months between the United States Grand Prix and the title decider in South Africa. Between the races, tragedy struck in the non-championship Mexican Grand Prix where Ricardo Rodriguez was killed. The teams sent their cars out to South Africa for 3 races, culminating in the South African Grand Prix. Before Christmas, the 5th Rand Grand Prix was run over 50 laps at Kyalami near Johannesburg. Motorbike champion Gary Hocking in the Rob Walker Lotus. Sadly, he died in a crash at Westmead a week later. Jim Clark led from start to finish in his Lotus 25, with teammate Trevor Taylor close behind. Both Graham Hill and Richie Ginther retired. Gearbox and oil pressure problems a worry in the hot weather, with the main race only weeks away. In front of the big summertime crowd, it was a Lotus 1-2 with John Surtees 3rd in the Lola. The Formula One season reached its final race at the end of December at the East London circuit. Either Graham Hill or Jim Clark could win the championship. Clark was relaxed as he talked to his friends. An amiable grin from Bruce McLaren. Graham Hill and BRM engineer Tony Rudd. The beachside East London circuit used parts of public roads and offered long straights and tight turns. BRM's number 2, Richie Ginther. Clark makes his way towards the start. 90,000 spectators were present to watch the action. Clark took pole position with Hill alongside him. At the start, Clark went into the lead with Hill chasing. Clark was in dominant form and Hill could not keep up. The battle for 3rd was between McLaren, Surtees and Maggs. It looked as if BRM's championship hopes were over, as by an ever-increasing margin, Clark led Hill. Bruce McLaren was holding gamely on to 3rd place in the Cooper. BRM owner Sir Alfred Owen watched anxiously. Then the first sign of a problem for Team Lotus as Trevor Taylor crawled round to retire, passed by Richie Ginther. John Surtees retired too, with engine trouble. A nervous Trevor Taylor watches from the pits. His concern was due to the fact that Clark's car had started to trail smoke. A bearded Stirling Moss, still recovering from his Goodwood crash, waits in the pit lane. Clark's Lotus is out of the race, An oil union had come undone and all the engine oil had drained out. BRM headed towards victory, while Jim Clark was disappointed. Graham Hill won the South African Grand Prix and the Constructors' Championship for BRM. Hill led home the Coopers of McLaren and Mags. The only other driver to go the distance was Brabham in the Brabham BT3. It was Graham Hill's 4th win of the season and secured for him the Drivers' World Championship, due reward for the dogged way Hill had made his way to the top of Grand Prix racing. The racing year is 1963. Graham Hill in the BRM and Jim Clark in the Lotus are the main contenders.
Pace car pulls out.
Clark also tackled the Indianapolis 500.
Martelli Jones grabs the lead with Jim Hurtubise right on his tail.
Jim has 2 Grand Prix victories to his credit already this season, the Belgian and the Dutch. And if he carries on like this, he's going to finish up 1963 World Champion.
Le Mans continued to be Ferrari's domain, although Ford was taking an interest in sports car racing. The Monte Carlo rally opened the year, and all the contenders had a sprint around the Grand Prix circuit to finish the rally, some with less success than others. The rally had starting points in Stockholm, Athens and Edinburgh. Snowdrifts meant that the Athens starters couldn't reach the finish. The big man in the little car, Sweden's 18-stone Erik Karlsson and the 841cc 3-cylinder Saab, won the Monte Carlo rally. The team prize went to Citroën, who had 5 cars among the top 10, a fine achievement after losing some of their best drivers who could not get through from Athens. All the first 7 cars in the rally had front-wheel drive, and the first 3 cars started from Stockholm. Sweden scored a double success when Uwe Rosqvist in her works-entered Mercedes 220 SE won the coveted Coupe des Dames. 33-year-old Erik Karlsson became the first driver for 30 years to win the rally 2 years in succession. 22 points behind Karlsson in second was Pauli Toivonen of Finland in a Citroën. A works-entered Mini Cooper driven by Rauno Aaltonen of Finland and Tommy Ambrose from England was third. First to congratulate Karlsson was Pat Moss, soon to be his wife. Pat's brother Stirling was in the news when he announced he was retiring from racing after having a private test in a Lotus sports car at Goodwood. A year earlier, he nearly lost his life in a racing crash on the same track. He said he didn't think his reactions had slowed down, but said his concentration was not so good. This is a great disappointment. I'd have liked to have made a comeback. Years later, he realized that he tried to return too soon. The 47th Targa Florio was a fierce battle between Porsche and Ferrari. The Tommy Hitchcock Zarab Cioccatua Ferrari 250 GTO was 8th, while the factory 246 of Ludovico Scarfiotti didn't finish. There were even 2 minis competing. Bernard Caillet and Rob Slotemacher were 25th. Alfa Romeo Giulietta SZs of Castagnini and Ferleno, followed by Giunti and Datti. 18th was the Donato Mascaleros Lancia Flaminia Zagato. The Targa Florio was won by Joe Bonnier and Carlo Maria Abate in the Porsche 718 GTR. Only 11 seconds behind came Willy Marese in the Ferrari, slowed by loose bodywork. Porsches took 3rd and 5th places, Ferraris 4th and 6th. The 15th BRDC International Trophy saw many of the Grand Prix contenders on the grid. John Surtees had joined Ferrari. Current world champion Graham Hill was back for BRM. Dan Gurney joined Jack Brabham at Brabham. Bruce McLaren and Tony Maggs again drove for Cooper. Graham Hill's teammate at BRM, Richie Ginther. And Jim Clark was partnered by Trevor Taylor in the Lotus 25s. The race was run over 52 laps. Clark led away, followed by Surtees. The former motorbike champion held second for half the race before dropping out with an oil leak. That left Jim Clark untroubled in the lead. British cars filled the first four places. Jim Clark, the winner. Bruce McLaren of New Zealand was second, with Trevor Taylor third, and Innes Ireland fourth.
Giri, trofeo esso a Vallelunga per il Gran Premio Roma. Partono in mucchio italiani e stranieri per una corsa tirata sino allo spasimo, a quasi 130 di media.
The 15th Rome Grand Prix was held at Vallelunga.
Gli italiani ad uno rimangono per strada.
The non-championship Formula One race was run over two heats of 40 laps. Both heats finished with the same three cars coming home in the first three places, and each time they were the only three cars to complete the distance. The winner was Britain's Bob Anderson in a Lola Mark IV. The only one to threaten the leaders was Franco Bernabei in his De Tomaso, but his engine blew up while he was leading the first heat and he was unable to take part in the second.
Vince Bob Anderson su una Lola Climax V8, una vettura che pesa 451 kg e ha una potenza di 185 cavalli.
The World Championship began with the Monaco Grand Prix and a full field of cars lined up for the prestigious race. Jim Clark had pole position with Graham Hill alongside. John Surtees was on the second row with Richie Ginther.
All set for the Monaco Grand Prix, and Prince Rainier is there to give it a real royal start. There are 15 cars in the race, the first of the 10 Grand Prix, counting in the World Championship for the year. They have to do 100 laps, total distance 195 miles. Number 9, Jim Clark in a Lotus, on his tail, world champion Hill, BRM. Innes Ireland in a bit of trouble. At halfway, Jim Clark leading. And here comes a V6 Ferrari driven by John Surtees. Jim Clark's out of it with jammed gears, so the lead's taken by Hill. A victory for Graham Hill in the BRM. Prince Rainier presents the trophy.
Hill also received £700 prize money. Richie Ginther was second, Bruce McLaren third, and John Surtees fourth. A new era for the Indianapolis 500 began in 1963. Following Cooper's lead 2 years earlier, Lotus entered a car for Jim Clark. Dan Gurney had brought Ford and Lotus together and had his own Lotus entry. Could the rear-engine cars beat the Offie-powered roadsters?
Jimmy Clark, Grand Prix driver from Scotland, is ready in his Lotus Ford number 92. Oh, it won't be long now. The drivers are getting ready. Goggles, handkerchiefs, cold cream. Anyway, they're ready for those famous words. And the cars move out. Pace car pulls out. And they're off. Parnelli Jones grabs the lead with Jim Hurtubise right on his tail. It's Jones, Hurtubise, Bobby Marshman, and Roger Ward on the backstretch. Hurtubise is trying hard for that lead. Fingelstad in car 54. He's okay. Jones is in for his first pit stop. McCluskey grabs the lead with Clark and Gurney close behind. Jim Clark takes second as they roar past the stands. Jones goes right out again to do battle for that lead spot. But Jim Clark and his Lotus Ford takes the lead. It's Clark first, McCluskey second, with Gurney coming up fast. McCluskey's in the pits. And the Lotus Fords are running 1 and 2. Jim Clark and Dan Gurney lead the race. It's now the 96th lap. Clark goes in for tires and gas. Uh-oh, he stopped short of the hydraulic platform and they have to push him on. That could be expensive. Jim has been leading for 28 laps and that's a great record for a rookie driver and a rookie car. The car is real lightweight and easy on tires. This change should last the rest of the race. Look out, a spin in the pits. It's Jim McElreath. He came in pretty hot, too hot. That got him on their feet. Uh-oh, Dan Gurney's in for an unscheduled pit stop. His right front wheel is loose. Wasn't replaced tight enough. Too bad. Jones has only a 3.5-second lead over Jim Clark. Looks like the action has moved to the stands. It's Colin Chapman. He's detected oil leaking from Jones' car and is a bit unhappy. Now there's a real rhubarb. The question whether or not to black flag Jones. But the decision keeps Jones in the race. The end is near and it's still Jones. Can Jimmy Clark catch him? Roger McCluskey's running third. Here's the white flag. One more lap to go. Time's running out and Providence takes over. Oh no, McCluskey's spinning. It's the last lap and he had third place sewed up. What a tough break. The checkered flag is out, and Parnelli Jones wins the race. Jim Clark and the Lotus Ford take second. And here he comes, the winner, heading for victory lane, the man himself, Parnelli Jones, a deserving winner.
The second round was the Belgian Grand Prix at Spa-Francorchamps. Graham Hill was on pole, with Dan Gurney's Brabham second quickest and Willie Moracy third in the fastest Ferrari. Jim Clark had gearbox trouble and was on row 3. The weather changed on race day and conditions were damp, with Clark making an extraordinary start to lead the field. He was followed by Graham Hill and Gurney. Tony Maggs spun off on lap 27. Moracy dropped back with engine trouble and Brabham ran into electrical trouble, so Gurney was able to make up the lost places again. Surtees suffered a problem, leaving Gurney third with Ginther fourth, McLaren fifth and Maggs sixth. A storm then broke over the track, and as this was happening, Hill's BRM stopped with gearbox failure. In the worst of the rain, Gurney fell back with water swirling around in his cockpit and was passed by Bruce McLaren's Cooper 2 laps from the finish. On a circuit he disliked intensely, Jim Clark scored his second win, levelling the championship with Graham Hill at 1 win each. Bruce McLaren was second, Dan Gurney third. Fourth place was taken by Richie Ginther, 1 lap behind in the BRM. Fifth was Swedish Cooper driver Joe Bonnier, and sixth, Dutch privateer Karel Godin de Beaufort, both 2 laps behind.
Alfa Romeo's destined for disappointment. And now the gas turbine car just 24 hours away from fame. The tension's building. The jet car's second driver, Richie Ginther, attempts the impossible, to relax before the race of races, while Graham Hill, his partner, simply polishes the tense moments away. Now there's a hush which masks the whole character of a Le Mans weekend, as the mechanics and officials check and seal. Excitement's at its peak. In 2 seconds now, the race will be on from its running start.
Brabham and Rover cooperated to produce a gas turbine car, which was entered in a special class. Ferrari was favoured to win with an impressive 11-car lineup. Aston Martin had DB4 GTs and the Project 215 car, and there was a lone Maserati Tipo 151.
A famous face no longer racing.
AC Cobra made its debut in a team managed by Stirling Moss. Bruce McLaren walks away from his burning Aston Martin with an E-Type also looking second-hand. For outright honours, there was a fierce fight between the Parks Maglioli, the Surtees Mairesi and the Scafiotti Bandini Ferraris. Mairesi's car caught fire and burnt out in the S's. Graham Hill hops out of the Rover and Ginther prepares to get in. Turbines as an automotive power source didn't make it into production, but the technology was there to be developed. The Wagstaff Ferguson Elite won the 1300cc class. On Sunday morning, Ludovic Scafiotti and Lorenzo Bandini took the lead in their Ferrari and went on to win the 1963 race.
Dawn through the S-bends. Dawn when the surviving drivers still have to keep their lap average up or better it. And one driver who's hit the sandbags is digging himself out to go on to finish 12th. Five minutes to go now, and by weight of numbers, the Ferraris are in the lead as they have been for years.
The Whispering Turbine toured around in what would have been 10th position had it been entered in the race proper. The Dutch Grand Prix saw the win go to Jim Clark. He was a lap ahead of Dan Gurney and John Surtees.
At Reims, in the heart of the Champagne country, the world's greatest drivers set off on the 273 miles of the French Grand Prix. And in the lead from the drop of the flag is Scotland's Jim Clark, Lotus number 18. Jim has 2 Grand Prix victories to his credit already this season, the Belgian and the Dutch. And if he carries on like this, he's going to finish up 1963 world champion. He's in trouble early with a misfiring engine, but he still hangs on to his lead. There's Maurice Trintignant working his way up the field. It isn't easy to break from the pack on this high-speed circuit because the faster the going, the more slipstreaming counts. That's why it's more important than ever to get ahead from the start and stay there. Jim Clark does stay there, clocking a lap record on the way. Tony Maggs in second place and Graham Hill in third are still behind when Jim crosses the line. So now Jim's clear favourite for the world title.
Clark won his 3rd Grand Prix in succession by nearly a minute from Maggs, with Hill third, having lost time at the start. The British Grand Prix returned to Silverstone after 2 years at Aintree. Jim Clark qualified 2/10 faster than Dan Gurney's Brabham, and the front row was completed by Graham Hill and Jack Brabham. Rather than seeing Clark take the lead as usual, the crowd saw Brabham and Gurney go ahead, with McLaren and Hill also ahead of Clark. It didn't last long, and on lap 4, Clark was back in the lead again. McLaren and Brabham went out with engine trouble. This promoted Hill to 3rd. On lap 59, Gurney also went out with engine failure, and Clark had a minute lead over Hill and Surtees. On the last lap, Hill ran out of fuel, which allowed Surtees past. Richie Ginther was 4th and Lorenzo Bandini 5th. Jim Clark now led Graham Hill by 17 points. At the Nurburgring, Clark was again dominant in qualifying, although he was run close by the Ferrari of John Surtees. Completing the front row was the Scuderia Centro Sud BRM of Lorenzo Bandini, which was faster than Graham Hill's factory car. Clark went into the lead while Brabham was left behind. Clark had engine troubles, so Ginther took the lead, with Surtees moving to second by the end of the lap. On lap 2, Willy Mairesi had a serious crash at Flugplatz that ended his Formula One career, while Bandini undid his good work. Ginther's BRM suffered gearbox trouble and he dropped behind Surtees, Clark, Hill and McLaren. Graham Hill went out with another gearbox failure. Although Clark continued to fight with Surtees, the Lotus driver was suffering from a misfire and gradually began to drop back. Surtees duly won the race, scoring Ferrari's first victory for nearly 2 years. All this left Ginther third. Mags was fourth until his Cooper had engine trouble and dropped back. That allowed Siffert into fourth until he suffered differential failure, so fourth was inherited by the old Porsche of Gerhard Mitter. Roger Penske brought his Cooper Xeric Special over from America for the Guards Trophy.
The American Cooper ahead of Tony Maggs, and Roy Salvadori lies third there on the inside after making a rather shaky start. These 2.7-litre Climax engines are the development of the old 2.5-litre Formula One racing engines. It's Tony Maggs second, Roy Salvadori third, and Tom Mayer fourth as they come down round the bottom bend, and then Graham Hill on the GTO Ferrari, who is just ahead of number 23, which is Innes Ireland on the DB4 Aston Martin. Meantime, the American still holds on Tony Maggs and Roy Salvadori as they go through the South Bank with his American-built Cooper Monaco, which is in third place, 21 seconds behind.
26-year-old Pennsylvanian Roger Penske led all the way to win by 40 seconds from Roy Salvadori, with another American, Tim Mayer, third. Jim Clark continued his domination of Grand Prix racing when he won the Italian from Richie Ginther. Clark secured the 1963 World Championship, taking third place behind Hill and Ginther in the US Grand Prix. Clark won his 6th race of the year in the altitude of Mexico City. Jack Brabham was a distant second. Two months after the Mexican Grand Prix, the final round of the World Championship took place in South Africa. Jack Brabham took the advantage off the line, but Clark and Surtees quickly pushed him back to third position. Trevor Taylor spun off, rejoining down the order. Brabham's challenge faded when he lost power and was overtaken by Surtees and Hill. Surtees retired with an engine problem which elevated Graham Hill to third at the finish. Ginther would have been fourth, but he suffered a transmission problem while Brabham spun in the closing laps and had to retire. This meant that Bruce McLaren ended up fourth in his Cooper Climax, with Bandini fifth and Bonnier sixth, although he was 2 laps behind. By the end of the race, Jim Clark had lapped the whole field, apart from second-placed Dan Gurney. Jim Clark's wins were characterized by sheer speed, setting the pace and outdriving his rivals. 27-year-old Clark won a record 7 races on his way to the World Championship, and Lotus won the Constructors' title. Could BRM, Ferrari, Brabham or Cooper respond in 1964? '64 was the high point of swinging 60s Britain. In racing, that was shown by the number of British drivers and teams taking on the lone Italian Ferrari. The Scuderia turned to John Surtees to lead them back to competitiveness. There was a challenge to Ferrari's sports car supremacy by Ford. It promised to be a bumper year. The motorsport season opened with the annual racing car show at Olympia in London. Pride of place went to Jim Clark's 1963 World Championship winning Lotus 25. The proliferation of manufacturers in Britain was demonstrated by Stirling Moss trying out an Elva sports car. The Ferrari-badged Austin 7 was used for a spot of 60s-style car cramming. The 33rd Monte Carlo rally saw a David and Goliath battle between the small Saabs and Mini Coopers against the big Ford Falcon rally sprints. Erik Karlsson, winner of the 1962 and 63 rallies, who drove a Saab from Oslo, finished third. Pat Moss Karlsson won the Ladies' Cup for the fourth time and finished fifth in the general classification. Fastest cars overall were the Ford Falcons, although some of the driving was a little wild. It was part of Ford's international motorsport push. Jovial Ulsterman Paddy Hopkirk and co-driver Henry Lydon started from Minsk in Russia in their Mini. They led throughout the road section and maintained their advantage in the speed test. Runners-up were Bo Lungfelt and Fergus Sager of Sweden in the Falcon. The Targa Florio once again was a Ferrari-Porsche duel as it had been for the past several years. From the USA, Carol Shelby entered 4 AC Cobras. Antonio Pucci of Italy and Colin Davis of Britain sped into the lead on the 6th lap in their Porsche 904 GTS. The GTO Ferrari of Fassetti and Guichet. AC Cobras of Phil Hill and Bob Bondurant, and Arena and Coco. Roberto Bussinello and GC Todara were third in the Alfa Romeo TZ. Defending champion Joe Bonnier of Sweden was the early leader, but had to withdraw when an axle broke on his Porsche. Only 21 out of 66 starters completed the grueling race. Ferleno and Taramazza were fifth in their Ferrari. The Fiat 8V of Lestano and Cucinotta. The Mini Cooper of Rupert Jones and Harry Ratcliffe didn't finish. Best placed Cobra was the Gurney Allen entry in 8th. Antonio Pucci, who was born in Sicily, and Colin Davis covered the 720 kilometers in 7 hours 10 minutes, 13 minutes ahead of Porsche teammates Gianni Balzarin of Italy and Herbert Linger of Germany. The 1964 World Championship season got off to its usual start at the Monaco Grand Prix, with 100 laps of the round-the-houses circuit. Jim Clark went into the lead at the start, hotly pursued by Jack Brabham and Dan Gurney in the Brabhams. Jack was forced to retire with engine trouble, and Gurney later had gearbox problems. Having pitted to make suspension repairs, Clark's Lotus then suffered from failing oil pressure. Graham Hill took over the lead and gradually drove himself into an unbeatable position, breaking the lap record on lap 53.
Dan Gurney and Surtees and Richie Ginther, under the eyes of Prince Rainier and Princess Grace.
He eventually came home more than a lap in front of teammate Richie Ginther. Peter Arundel, making his Lotus debut, was third, with Jim Clark eventually coming fourth. BRM repeated the previous year's 1-2. Grand Prix de Spa was a 500-kilometre race, counting towards the World Championship of Grand Touring cars. As the only substantial manufacturer of GT cars, Ferrari was in a strong position. Mike Parks, who worked for Ferrari as an engineer-driver, took the lead in his GTO. He'd already won the Sebring 12-hour race. 44 cars entered the 36-lap race. Wealthy privateers like Jean Guichet and Jean Goblet were just the sort of customers who could afford to buy and race Ferraris. 60,000 people watched. Sadly, one person was killed and 3 injured when a Lotus Cortina, driven by rising star Jackie X, left the track at the Master Kink and somersaulted into the crowd. He suffered injuries, but recovered. Phil Hill in the Cobra Daytona Coupe, about to be lapped by winner Parks. It was almost a clean sweep for Ferrari, taking 5 out of the first 6 places. Following Parks home were Jean Guichet, Lorenzo Bandini, David Piper, and in 5th, the Porsche of Edgar Barth. Next was the Dutch Grand Prix. Dan Gurney was on pole position in his factory Brabham, ahead of Jim Clark's Lotus and Graham Hill's BRM. Clark managed to squeeze into the lead, with Hill and Gurney giving chase and the fast-starting Peter Arundel in 4th. John Surtees was the man on the move in the early part of the race in the new V8 158 as he overtook Arundel, Gurney and Hill. In number 20, Peter Arundel's Lotus. Dan Gurney dropped out with a broken steering wheel. Richie Ginther wasn't on the pace. Hill's BRM began to misfire and he gradually dropped back. His place was taken by Arundel on lap 47. Jim Clark won by nearly a minute, with Surtees second and Arundel a lap behind. The Scots' victory gained him 9 points in the World Drivers' Championship. He was now on level terms with Graham Hill, who finished 4th. Veteran driver Eddie Sachs prepares for the Indianapolis 500. Jim Clark led early on in the Lotus Ford, but was forced to stop with tyre trouble. In a tragic fiery accident, Sachs and Dave McDonald crashed and died. The race was held up for 100 minutes. 29-year-old Texan AJ Foyt went on to win, the final Indy victory for a roadster. 300,000 fans were at the Nurburgring for the annual 1,000-kilometre race. With the Mark I, Ford began their assault on sports car racing, and especially on Ferrari. Racing under the Total Performance slogan to pep up their international image, Ford was competing in all disciplines of the sport. Bruce McLaren and Phil Hill qualified second, but retired with suspension damage to their Ford. John Surtees lost a wheel. Throughout the 44-lap race, the Ferrari 275P of Ludovico Scarfiotti and Nino Vaccarella was never out of the first 3. They led for the final 12 laps and sped to the checkered flag. They had covered the 1,000 kilometers in 7 hours, 8 minutes and 27 seconds at an average speed of 140 kilometers per hour. Second was a Ferrari 250 GTO of Mike Parks and Jean Guichet. Third was the Porsche 904 GT of Dutchman Ben Pon and Germany's Gerhard Koch. Scarfiotti and Vaccarella celebrate. Jim Clark won the Belgian Grand Prix when Dan Gurney and Bruce McLaren both ran out of petrol. The 1964 24-hour race at Le Mans saw the Mark I Ford, driven by Phil Hill and Richie Ginther, lead early on but retire with gearbox woes. Graham Hill and Joe Bonnier's Ferrari 330p was in contention throughout the race. They were third after 6 hours, battling with the Bandini Surtees Ferrari. After 11 hours, Hill and Bonnier took second, chasing Jean Guichet and Nino Vaccarella's 275p. Ferrari had 5 in the first 6, split only by the AC Cobra of Dan Gurney and Bob Bondurant, who finished 4th to win the Grand Touring class. Ferrari comfortably won the 1964 Prototype Championship from Porsche and narrowly the GT category from AC Cobra. The French Grand Prix was back at Rouen, and the BRMs were not very competitive on this occasion, with Graham Hill on the third row of the grid. Still racing was 47-year-old Maurice Trintignant. The battle between Jim Clark's Lotus and Dan Gurney's Brabham for dominance continued, with Clark taking pole position and Gurney second. John Surtees was on the outside of the front row in his Ferrari, while the second row featured Clark's teammate Peter Arundel and Jack Brabham in the second Brabham. At the start of the race, Clark went into the lead, with Gurney and Surtees chasing. During the first lap, Bruce McLaren spun to the back of the field. On the third lap, Surtees dropped back with a split oil pipe, and Graham Hill had a spin. Clark and Gurney were left alone at the front, with Brabham moving up into third. Hill recovered from his spin and worked his way back up to 4th place by lap 24. Innes Ireland leads Lorenzo Bandini and motorbike ace Mike Halewood, following John Surtees' example. On lap 31, Clark's engine failed, so Gurney was left in the lead with Brabham a long way behind and Hill closing fast on the Australian. On lap 37, Hill overtook Brabham, but Jack stayed with him. The two were separated by less than a second at the finish. Brabham might have been frustrated, but as Dan Gurney had just won the team its first World Championship victory, it was a great day for Jack and his designer Ron Toranak. Peter Arundel was 4th, Richie Ginther 5th, and Bruce McLaren 6th. Jim Clark still led the championship on 21 points. Brands Hatch hosted its first British Grand Prix, which was also the Grand Prix of Europe. For the first time since Brooklands closed in 1939, international motorsport was held near London. The Union flag falls and Jim Clark took the lead. A shunt on the start line eliminated Frank Gardner. Dan Gurney jumped into second place until he was passed on lap 2 by Graham Hill. The tense duel between Clark and Hill gripped the attention of the 100,000-strong crowd. There was barely a car length between them as Hill tried to get through. After 4 laps, Gurney pulled into the pits with the transistor ignition of his car smoking. He lost 5 laps having it repaired. Clark led Hill with John Surtees 3rd and Jack Brabham 4th. Jack pitted to have his suspension checked and reclaimed fourth from Lorenzo Bandini. Clark was able to keep the BRM of Graham Hill at bay, dropping back a little with brake problems. At the halfway stage, Clark had built up his lead to 10 seconds, and from then on his victory was never really in doubt. Colin Chapman looks on anxiously. The checkered flag, and Jim Clark wins the 1964 British Grand Prix. In the end, he was only 2.8 seconds ahead of Hill. In third place, John Surtees was over a minute behind Hill. Fourth was Jack Brabham, and fifth, Lorenzo Bandini. The victory enabled Jim Clark to increase his lead in the championship to 4 points over Graham Hill. It's all eyes on the flag as the starter saunters off at the Nurburgring for the German Grand Prix. Wait for it! Sharing the front row were Jim Clark, Dan Gurney, Lorenzo Bandini and John Surtees. Graham Hill was down on the second row with Jack Brabham and Bruce McLaren's Cooper. Practice was overshadowed by an accident which left Dutch aristocrat Carlo Godin de Beaufort with critical injuries after he went off at Bergwerk in his outdated Porsche and hit a tree. Bandini made the best start. Clark soon dispensed with the Italian and he was followed past the Ferrari by Gurney and Surtees. Surtees overtook Gurney and then Clark for the lead. The big news at the German Grand Prix was that the Honda team was finally ready for action, and Ronnie Bucknam was there to drive the new machine. On lap 12, the steering failed and it plunged into a ditch, shearing off 3 wheels and crumpling the body. Jim Clark had engine trouble and eventually retired, and this left Surtees ahead of Gurney and Graham Hill with Brabham a long way back in 4th place. Gurney dropped back as his engine overheated and Brabham ran into trouble with his transmission. John Surtees was able to win the race to score Ferrari's first win of the year. Graham Hill came home second, a minute behind. Lorenzo Bandini claimed third. Surtees moved into championship contention, now third behind Hill and Clark. Sadly, Godin de Beaufort died the day after the race. The first Austrian Grand Prix was held on a bumpy airfield circuit at Zeltweg, and Lorenzo Bandini scored his one and only Grand Prix victory. Richie Ginther was second and Privateer Bob Anderson a heroic third. At the Italian Grand Prix, the Honda continued to create interest. Once more, it was specially flown in from Tokyo. Jim Clark was more concerned about the Ferraris. John Surtees started from pole but made a slow start as Dan Gurney raced into the lead. Graham Hill was left at the start with a burnt-out clutch and spent the entire race as a spectator. Ferrari engineers unveiled a special engine for the Italian Grand Prix, a powerful flat 12, although Surtees elected to use the V8. For 61 of the 78 laps, Surtees battled it out with Dan Gurney in a typical Monza slipstreaming dice. The Honda lasted until lap 13, out with brake problems. Jim Clark was running third for the early part of the race, swapping positions with Bruce McLaren, but was forced to retire on lap 28. On lap 68, Gurney had to make a pit stop and he eventually finished 10th, leaving the way clear for Surtees to score a popular win in front of the Tifosi. Bruce McLaren's Cooper was a minute behind in second, and Lorenzo Bandini pipped Richie Ginther by 1/10 of a second for third. The race completed a triumphant hat-trick of wins for Ferrari. The 9 points Surtees collected put him within striking distance of the championship leaders. Graham Hill on 32 and Jim Clark on 30, both of whom retired from the race. Surtees was now on 28. Graham Hill bounced back in the US Grand Prix, which meant that the title could be won by either himself, Clark or Surtees. In Mexico, Jim Clark was the outsider, but a victory would give him the title. The Ferraris were racing in the blue and white of their US importers under the North American Racing Team banner. Graham Hill dropped to 10th when the elastic on his goggles broke just before the start, while Surtees' car was misfiring badly. Surtees' engine cured itself and Hill moved into the vital 3rd position. He was under threat from Bandini, and on lap 31 they made contact and spun. Hill rejoined, but the damage was done. It seemed that Clark was going to win a second title, but on the last lap his engine seized up. Gurney went through, and Bandini let Surtees into a championship-winning 2nd place. Il Grande John became the 1964 world champion. John Surtees had helped turn Ferrari's fortunes around in Grand Prix racing. Famously, he became the only man to win world championships on 2 wheels and on 4, both with Italian teams. The racing year finished with an event that was growing in importance, the Macau Grand Prix. Held on the unforgiving Gaia street circuit in the Portuguese colony, drivers came from all around Asia to compete. 14 racing and sports cars set out on 60 laps, a distance of 224 miles. Philippines millionaire Arsenio Laurel, winner of the previous 2 Grand Prix, led in the early stages until he retired. Bill Wiley of Hong Kong took over but also had to stop. Hong Kong policeman Albert Poon, who had already won the Johor and Malaysian Grand Prix, cruised home to an easy win. Poon broke the 3.8-mile lap record with a time of 3 minutes 5.4 seconds, 1 second better than Laurel's mark set in 1963. Poon finished more than a lap in front of John Kirk, who took 2nd in a Lotus Elan. 3rd was Hong Kong's Steve Holland in a Lotus 18. Albert Poon said he drove according to plan and that he would give the £625 prize money to his wife.